Hello, everybody. I'm Joy Cardine. I am your moderator for this Plato-Madison lecture today. This won't be so much a lecture or a presentation as it will be a conversation. Our guest, UW-Madison Language Sciences Professor Joe Salmons, will ask us questions about what we think about English in Wisconsin, the pronunciation, words, word forms, grammar, and other features that make Wisconsin English distinct. We will also discuss how Wisconsin English developed and how it's evolving. So get ready to chat by using the chat feature, and you can respond to Professor Salmons' questions, and you can ask your own. Joe Salmons is a language sciences professor at UW-Madison. He also directs the Center for the Study of Upper Midwestern Cultures. He earned his BA in philosophy from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and his PhD in Germanic linguistics from the University of Texas, Austin. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. I really love doing these things for reasons that will become clear. Joy asked that folks introduce themselves in the chat, say what your hometown is. I'd like to ask you something else. I'd like you to put into the chat how you can tell that people are from Wisconsin by the way they talk. So when you try to strike up, Joy was just saying it, sometimes she is out of state and strikes up a conversation and somebody says, "You're from Wisconsin." How is it that you know that about somebody? Just put those features into the chat, and we'll talk through a bunch of those. So, like Joy says, what I'm going to do is ask you questions and compare your answers to other things that we know about English in Wisconsin and are finding out. You maybe can't tell it quite yet, but maybe you can. I grew up not here, but very far away in Kings Mountain, North Carolina, in Western North Carolina, and have lived here for a very long time. And I'm trying as hard as I can to speak very standard English and not show my Southern accent, but it will come out at various points for sure. So our topics are going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to talk a little bit about awareness of Wisconsin English and its history, attitudes toward Wisconsin English, and some features of Wisconsin English. But really, there is one reason that I do these, and that one reason is the Q&A. People I work with, my students, my colleagues, we have written a whole bunch of papers now, published articles based on things that came out of these public presentations. We just learn so much from them, things that we had never thought about, things we didn't know. In addition to research, my teaching is often really built around things that we learn at these events. If you respond, if you ask questions, if you make comments, there's a good chance that you're shaping research that'll come out of here and teaching that's coming out of here. And I'm seeing tons of really good answers in the chat already. So, like I said, as people were still coming in, when you hear somebody speak, what tells you that they're from Wisconsin, just put it in the chat. And just to give us a little sample, a little piece of something that'll give us something to talk about later.
Check out this verbo.
Oh, sorry, we have to get through
They're your cousins.
There we go.
Hey there, folks. As you can tell by this pristine pile of snow behind me, winter is in full swing. The question is, do you have everything you need to survive it? And if the answer is yeah, no, well, follow me. I'll get you hooked up real good. Folks, we begin with the 5-gallon bucket. Now, this is the Swiss Army knife of buckets, okay? Useful in every situation. Toss some ice in here. You got cooler.
So that's just to give you a little hint of a piece of how people are thinking about and talking about Wisconsin English these days. We'll refer to that in various places as we go. So what screams Wisconsin English to you? I've got a whole bunch of really good answers that I'm seeing in the chat here. Yeah, like Liz Really striking to me were the vowel sounds when I came. Blinkers, lots of stuff like that. Roof for roof, you betcha, and on and on and on. Down by Schuster's, soda and soda pop, you guys. But one that's coming up a bunch already, as usual, is bubbler. And this is a photograph that was taken by a linguist at Marquette, Sonia Barnes, and it was at Adventure Park in Milwaukee that she found it. You can find these all over the place, of course. Dane County Airport, where if they still have it, I haven't been there in a couple of years, had a marker on one of theirs, labeling it a bubbler, and so on. So the history of this is a pretty interesting thing. It took a while for me to figure it out, and other people found this ad that the name comes from a valve that the Kohler company used and sold. And you have a difference between the drinking fountain and the bubbler, where the bubbler has water coming up through the middle, and drinking fountain has the water going across. Some people, including my wife, who grew up in Madison, distinguish the two. If the water comes up in the middle, it's a bubbler. If the water goes across, it's a drinking fountain. So that's a difference that a few people have. Not many people do. If you have that difference, you might mention that in the chat as well. But so a whole bunch, I didn't count, I couldn't count, it was going by too fast, but a whole bunch of people in the chat mentioned bubbler as an example. And you think, oh, everybody in Wisconsin must say bubbler. Well, we did a survey a couple of years ago, online survey. We got a couple of thousand responses overall. And here is the set of people in blue dot for each person who said they actually say bubbler. The yellow, the darker yellow, is places we got responses from. So some parts of the state, we just didn't get a lot of responses. Some places we got a lot. What you see is that not everybody says that they say bubbler. And a couple of years ago, I gave a related talk in Stevens Point, which is not really core bubbler territory necessarily, and asked people what they thought of as a Wisconsin feature. Bubbler was the first one, and everybody said, yeah. And I said, okay, so how many of you actually say bubbler? A fifth of the hands went up, maybe a quarter of the hands went up. So clearly that was what was happening there. But if you ask people, do you have friends who say bubbler? Almost everybody has friends who say bubbler. So everybody knows it. It's really interesting that it carries a social meaning. So not everybody here says bubbler. A lot of people do, a lot of people don't. But everybody associates it with the state. It's really widely associated with the state of Wisconsin. A few years ago, a colleague then at UW Milwaukee, now at Cambridge University in England, Bert Vaux, did a survey online of American dialects, and he asked people what they called these things that you drink water from in a school. And you see that bubbler is associated with Wisconsin, but also with a little part of the Northeast of New England. That's where the valve sold well. It also sold well in Melbourne, Australia. We were at a conference a few years ago, 15 years ago now, in Melbourne. And my wife, who's also a linguist, comes running up to me at a coffee break and says, "Oh my God, you're not going to believe what just happened." What? I thought it was something terrible. A guy just asked me where the bubbler was. And I said, "Oh, there's so many linguists from Wisconsin. That's no surprise." And she said, "No, he had a total Wisconsin accent, or a total Australian accent." It turns out that the valve sold well in Melbourne, Australia too. So it's a pretty complicated term, but it tells us something about how words move around. So with that one out of the way, I want to know if you think you can tell that somebody is from Wisconsin just from how they speak. Just put a yes or a Y or an N in the chat if you think you can probably tell or probably can't tell that somebody's from Wisconsin just from talking to them for a few minutes. Just put Y or N into the chat. So we're getting mixed responses. Looks like a lot of, maybe a little over 50-50, yes and no. While you're doing that, a little piece of Wisconsin English that already came up in your Q&A. I'm going to play 2 words. And if a few people would be willing to write into the chat what you hear. Here's the first word.
Egg. 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 Egg.
Maybe a few people could type in what word you hear. Here's another word.
Egg. 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 Egg.
Here they are in full sentence context.
The latest egg report shows strong production, but with the hot weather now, Don knows there's bad news coming today.
The latest ag report shows strong production, but with the hot weather now, Don knows there's bad news coming today.
So, excuse me, I was on Wisconsin Public Radio a few years ago and asked the producer if she would have a few people from the staff read a sentence, a couple of sentences. That was one of them. I did it for a very specific reason. She got several people. You recognize the voices if you listen as often as I do. You hear this very distinctive Wisconsin pronunciation of ag, which sounds to me like apparently it does to many of you, like egg. When I first came, I began listening to Wisconsin Public Radio basically the day I arrived. And I was very surprised to hear that there was an egg report. I knew it as a dairy state. I didn't know it as an egg producing state. And it took me, I'm serious, a couple of days to realize that that was what was happening. This is the same pattern as the bag pattern that people mentioned in the chat about their very first, in the very first response about what you hear as Wisconsin English. So this is a robust piece. And these are radio broadcasters, so this is very standard English. This is not something that people suppress when they are speaking in formal situations. And yet, even though I bet a bunch of you have this feature, you still hear that pronunciation as egg and not as ag when you have it. So we'll come back to more features soon, but I want to move on to another piece for the moment. I'm going to play you 3 recordings. And again, I'll play all 3. And when you've heard all 3, just put Y's and N's. So YYN or YNY or whatever. Is this person from Wisconsin? Yes or no? So here they are, and I'll play them a couple of times so that you have a chance to hear them. So listen to all 3, then put in an answer for all 3 in order. Here we go. Well, here we go.
The story of Arthur and the rat. Once there was a young rat who couldn't make up his mind. The story of Arthur and the rat. Once there was a young rat who couldn't make up his mind.
That's number 1. Here's number 2.
Once there was a young rat named Arthur, who could never make up his mind. Whenever his friends asked him if he would like to go out with them, he would only answer, "I don't know." Once there was a young rat named Arthur, who could never make up his mind. Whenever his friends asked him if he would like to go out with them, he would only answer, "I don't know."
That's number 2, and here's number 3. Once there was a young rat named Arthur who could never make up his mind. Whenever his friends asked him if he'd like to go out with them, he would only answer, "I don't know." Once there was a young rat named Arthur who could never make up his mind. Whenever his friends asked him if he'd like to go out with them, he would only answer, "I don't know." Wow. This is the most consistent set of answers I have ever seen. to these questions. Thank you. So here are the answers. Speaker one, it looks like overwhelmingly people say no, not from Wisconsin. She was born at the beginning of the 20th century and was from Plymouth, Wisconsin, up in Sheboygan County. Speaker number two is from exactly the same place, Plymouth, recorded in the 2010. I think 2016 maybe was the year of that recording. And speaker number three was me speaking a little less standard than I'm speaking right now. And you think, oh, that's weird. We can hear number two overwhelmingly. People said yes or maybe. Not everybody did, but people mostly said yes or maybe to the young woman from Plymouth. People did not say yes almost at all to the speaker from Plymouth recorded in the 1950s. And people overwhelmingly said no to me being a Wisconsinite. Years ago, I was teaching a class on language in Wisconsin, and a young undergraduate who is now a practicing veterinarian, Danielle Schuld from Portage, said, I'd like to do a project on this. And she did her project, and we turned it into an article published in the Journal of Linguistic Geography. So she wrote one paper in linguistics, and it is published, and it's a really valuable paper. Here's what we found. We took recordings from the same places, old and new, and we played them to a lot of listeners, mostly but not all from Wisconsin. We said, is this person from Wisconsin? Same, we asked other questions, but that was the core question. And you can see what the responses were. The responses here are just reckoned as correct or not. So if they're from Wisconsin, yes. If they're not from Wisconsin, no. If you look at what we've got here, who were people most accurate about? We did Old Boston and New Boston, and we did Old North Carolina speaker who had a heavier accent than I did in my recording. Those were the most accurate. So everybody recognized that Bostonians and Western North Carolinians people could tell that we weren't from Wisconsin. And Cindy has a great question in the chat that we will come back around to in the Q&A, and we'll touch on a little bit more in the meantime. A couple of people said that the first speaker has almost a British sounding accent. That is a very common reaction. So in terms of accuracy, where is there the least accuracy? It's the old Wisconsin accents, the early 1950s and 60s recordings of Wisconsin, and California. California does not have a recognizable accent if you get outside of things like Valley Girl and so on. And it was pretty much random. You see that people were right around 50%. They were guessing on that. The old Wisconsin accents were variable. The Milwaukee speaker, the old Milwaukee speaker was people were pretty good at. But what's the middle? The middle, where people were pretty accurate but not completely accurate, is exactly like you were just now. The new Wisconsin recordings from Milwaukee, Plymouth, and Eau Claire. So we see a really interesting pattern here, and it's a surprising pattern. Old recordings from Wisconsin are not identifiable as Wisconsin. They sound very variable. That woman is the one who sounds most British or not quite American, but the others are not identifiable as Wisconsin either. The new Wisconsin recordings are really readily recognized as such. So places that have long established dialects and accents like Boston and Western North Carolina are recognizable. That hasn't changed very much over time. Old recordings and new recordings are both easily recognized as not Wisconsin. But here there's been a real change over time. And the question about what drives change is something we'll come back around to. Yes, immigration is part of it, but there's a lot of other stuff going on, and I made a note to talk about that. So people mostly kind of agreed that they could tell from how people talk that they're from Wisconsin. This is pretty much what we found in our survey. So people know, and they know that they know, but not overwhelming. It's not, so it's somewhat agree is the biggest category, but not a lot of strong disagreement here. So next question, and you can just put in a yes, a Y, or an N, or a maybe, if an M for a maybe. Wisconsin English sounds friendly to me. Do you think Wisconsin English sounds friendly? We've got something everybody can agree on, almost everybody, including a yeah. A couple of no's, a couple of maybes, but mostly yeses. Another question, maybe a little harder question, maybe a little more controversial question. Wisconsin English is generally good, correct English. So Y or N or maybe. Very different answer there. A lot of maybes, but more no's. Very few yeses, as I'm seeing. Of course, this is obviously not a scientific undertaking. That's something we do in somewhat different ways, but that's not what we're doing. A couple of people said things like, "There's no such thing." That warrants a little bit of comment. Here's an article from last summer in the Boston Globe, where the author is extremely bothered by the corruptions of English, which seem to get more numerous and hideous with every sunrise. And she's really bothered by things like the use of the word irregardless, which has been around since 1912, the use of simpatico, because it means nice in Italian, being used not as nice, but to have this more general, often sort of sympathetic type meaning. Things like talk to Mary or myself, and so on. This is what a previous columnist, a one-time columnist for the Boston Globe, Jan Freeman, called peeveology. People make sort of a pseudoscience of their peeves about language. One question for us, since I asked the question about correctness, is how does this stuff get going? How is it that people have ideas, especially these kinds of ideas about correct grammar? Well, this is a social and political construct. People built correctness as a thing, mostly in the early modern period. And it is not organically grown. It's not built around how people actually talked. A whole bunch of our stuff comes from this professor of poetry, who was also a bishop in the early 1700s through the late 1700s, who was really very interested in having people speak correct English, having people speak in proper ways. His name is Laub, and Robert Laub, and he is responsible for a set of things that we often learn in school as rules. It is I rather than it is me, which is what most of us would normally say. The difference between and among, between for two things and among for more than two, that you're not supposed to split infinitives, and that you're not supposed to use double negatives. And those, just take those last two as examples. The reason that he did that was Latin and logic. Why no split infinitives? In Latin, like in most of the Romance languages and Germanic languages, other than English, you can't split an infinitive. It's a simple single word. So if you know Spanish or French or Italian or Latin or German or Dutch, an infinitive is simply one single word. You can't insert something into it. So he followed that, said that that should be a model for English, even though we do it in a very different way. Why no double negatives? Because logically and mathematically, that would make a positive. So that was never part of English grammar. English, like many other languages, including Slavic languages, Hebrew, lots of languages of the world have double and multiple negatives as just a regular part of speech. I had years ago, I had a doctoral student who was from Poland, and we were meeting weekly about her dissertation. And she came in one day, and before we started talking shop, she said, "Joe, is it true? I heard that Southerners say double negatives." And I said, "Well, yes, I do it every day. I can do 4 or 5 negatives in a single clause. And she said, can you give me an example? And I said, I don't remember what the example was, but it was something like, I ain't never said nothing like that. She said, oh, it's just like Polish. What does it mean? And I said, well, the more negatives I put into a clause, the more emphatic I'm being about it. So I haven't ever said that is pretty mild, but I ain't never said nothing like that. Really, I'm telling you unambiguously, it's not how I do it. So what Lau did, and a whole army of other people over centuries, was change the language to get rid of things that were just natural parts of the language that had grown up and continued to be used. And those of us who didn't learn certain things from our English teachers at certain points continue to do that today. So these aren't connections to how people historically talked. They're made up and they end up being enforced by institutions like schools. So let's go back to our question of who speaks correct English. Dennis Preston, who did his PhD at Madison in the 1960s and is still a good friend of this university, did a classic study where he took a bunch of Michiganders and a bunch of Alabamians, and he asked them he gave them maps of the United States and said, okay, draw the areas where people speak the most and least correct English. And we transformed this into another kind of map where darker and bigger means more correct and lighter and smaller means less correct. And you can see that the Michiganders think pretty well of their own English, and they don't think particularly well of English in the South, especially the Deep South. So that's their view of correctness. What do you think he got from the Alabamians? Well, surprisingly similar results. So the folks from Alabama agreed that Southern English was not particularly correct English. They thought that Northern English was much more correct, and you see that the places where things are dark, New England, Maryland, and so on, Minnesota does well, Illinois, Ohio do well, Wisconsin, Michigan do okay, and so on. New Jersey, of course, does not do particularly well. It's not seen as having correct English. So interestingly, both Alabamians and Michiganders agreed that this was not, agreed that Southerners don't speak particularly correct English, and that people in the Midwest and the North typically do. He also asked them the other question that I ask you: who speaks the most pleasant English? I'll just give you the map from Alabama, which makes the point you need to know. Southerners sound pleasant. And a lot of northern states, New Jersey disappears, New York disappears, don't fare well on that count. So the Michigan data is sort of like the correctness data, it's roughly parallel. So let's go back to our survey of a couple of thousand people, overwhelmingly from Wisconsin. And I think these numbers, I forgot to double check, but I think these numbers are the Wisconsin respondents. Wisconsin English sounds friendly to me. So overwhelming agreement, very little disagreement, pretty much what we saw in the chat here. Wisconsin English is generally good, correct English. And here we see that sort of middle range, a lot of maybes, a lot of somewhat disagrees, some somewhat agrees. So pretty much you're tracking pretty much the way that the respondents on this survey, tracking what we got from the respondents on this survey. So what we got here is something that shows Wisconsin English is really being seen as pretty friendly, and it's reasonably correct, but not that correct. And we have to keep in mind that correctness is a really weird, complicated notion. So it's been a while since I asked you a question. Let's go back and get another question. I'm going to give you some sample sentences, 5 of them, and I want you just to put again in a line in the chat, yes, 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 if you say them all, in, if you don't say any of them. And just start, I'll give you a second to do that. So everybody agrees that number 3 is fine. And even I from North Carolina would say number 3 is fine. A whole bunch of people have got number 2, the A, nice weather today, A, and unfortunately it's not nice weather today. Getting a few yas. I think I saw some or no, and I don't remember seeing any anas going by. So we have old data on this, and we've got our data from our recent survey. The Dictionary of American Regional English, which was done here in Madison, had this as one of their questions. How would you finish the sentence? We ought to come back here again, blank. And here are the responses they got to that. There are a couple of responses mixed in from another question that they asked that's about a woman, so that's why some of the things look different there. Chicago and so say Ana. Keep that in mind for the Q&A. So a lot of non-responses. That's the NR in the third line, but you see mostly pretty familiar things. We don't have the Wisconsin forms really well attested in the Dictionary of American Regional English. So we put some of these in our survey, and one that we ask about is the Ana, which we just got a comment from Kathy about Chicago. And about a third of our respondents, or almost exactly a third of our respondents, recognize this as something people say. Almost nobody reported saying it themselves. And not that many people associated it with Wisconsin speech even. And people definitely do not associate it with proper English. And yes, right is another one of those. We call these tag questions. Basically, they do the work of allowing people to nod or say yeah or something real fast to indicate that they're following, that they understand. Yes, Milwaukee was core Ana territory. Some young people still have it around the state, though it's clearly seems to have become less common. We give you another example here from the same study. We did the or no. Most people recognize it as a Wisconsinism. Almost a quarter of people said they say it themselves, and almost a third of people say they associate it with Wisconsin speech. So here we've got something it's very similar thing, but it's faring much better. It doesn't seem to be losing ground like this. So these features got into the mix in a similar way. Something like no and Ana are things that probably come from immigration, as has already been raised in the chat a couple of times. And yes, ain't it is a piece of this puzzle as well. So these tag questions have changed. Which ones we use has changed a whole lot. There's still some distinctness here. I am convinced, but I have never gotten the data to prove it, and I'm hoping that I'll be working with a student in the next year or so to gather some data. I am convinced that Wisconsinites use a lot more of these tag questions, whether it's isn't it, or right, or don't you think, or you know, than people in other parts of the country, certainly in the South. When I came, I was really, I noticed how often people use that, these forms, whatever the particular form that they use is. This is probably connected to the fact that a lot of the immigrant languages that were widely spoken in the 19th and into the 20th century, and in part today, have a lot of tag questions, use a lot more tag questions than English does. A lot of kinds of Norwegian are like that. German is certainly like that, and so on. That's a piece of it. And so is, yes, Bob and Barb are right. And they can also seem rhetorical. Yes, it's true enough. And yes, tagging definitely sounds more friendly. It's more engaged. It's interacting with people. So there's a case where we have stuff happening in Wisconsin, in part directly associated with immigration, particular forms that have been taken over, but also indirectly associated with immigration. At least that's my hypothesis at this point, that these were super common, so people continue to use them even though they've started to use more generally English forms. So with that, these are things that people tend to notice and talk about in a lot of cases. I'm going to turn to something that people don't notice, and this is work that one of my outstanding graduate students, Sarah Holmstrom. If we were doing this live, I would have some of my graduate students here talking about their own work, but it's just kind of awkward to do that in this forum. But I will pass your comments and questions on to Sarah. She's working on a change that people really aren't noticing very much in American English, but that's really there. I want you, with your microphones off, I can't hear you, say out loud the words foot and can't. This is something that's famous in England, it's known in the Rockies, especially in Utah, and so on. Do you actually pronounce a T in both or either of these words? So say them again and pay attention to what your tongue's doing. So I pronounced them, I went out of my way to pronounce them both with a T before. In my normal speech, when I say foot and can't, my tongue, the front of my tongue never goes up and touches the alveolar ridge, the place behind my teeth. So say foot and can't again and see if your tongue moves. Does your tongue actually move and touch there, or does it not move and touch there? You can put a yes or a no. So we've got some yesers. Oh, this is the first time. So Bruce is a no. Hi, Bruce. Oh, this is the first time you're not perfectly in alignment with our results. So what Sarah did was she looked at recordings made in the 1950s and 60s, the same ones I used in the samples earlier on. And she and some other students went out and did some new recordings to see. So what's happening if you don't say a T there, like me, what most people are doing is using a glottal stop. You're closing your glottis for just a second. And that's the sound that we have at the beginning of both syllables of uh-oh. She went and looked at these things acoustically, so looked at the sound waves to see what people are actually doing. Here is what it looks like. I won't give you the technical story behind it, but it's pretty simple acoustic analysis. This is a glottal stop. This is somebody saying foot the way I would say it, basically with a different vowel. But. And you can see what you have is those where you have the really regular wave form. You see a lot of structure in the dark parts. That's the vowel. And where it starts to break up, you have a couple of little bit of irregular forms there. That's the glottal stop starting. And then the relative silence there, it's a noisy recording, so you don't have perfect silence. But that's a sign of a glottal stop, a pretty clear sign of a glottal stop. Carla and Michael ask, how do you differentiate can from can't? The glottal stop is enough to do it. Can, can't, for most people. There's a whole story between can and can't that we can talk about in the Q&A if you'd like. But Sarah found something really interesting that's not been talked about in the literature previously. A whole lot of people in her survey were not even saying a glottal stop. And it turns out, I've been looking at I looked at my speech after she did this. What they're doing is they're having almost a glottal stop, and it affects the vowel. So here, if you compare the one with a clear glottal stop where you just have that little bit of irregularity, what this speaker is doing, and you listen, maybe you can hear it. So this is rat coarsely in the story. It's a story called Arthur and the Rat. Arthur the rat. And what she's doing is she's not saying a glottal stop at all, but she's got what sometimes people talk about as vocal fry or creaky voice just at that little end of it. And that's what signals the T in her speech. So Sarah looked at new recordings and old recordings. Let's just, for time, let's just look at the last pair there. The WELS, Frederick Cassidy, who started the Dictionary of American Regional English, did recordings in the early 1950s. That was our speaker from Plymouth from the 1950s, for example. And then Sarah and her colleagues did recordings in 2018. What you see is that the pronunciation of an actual T there drops off. People still have a lot of it. It's still a majority in both cases. So people who say T's are not doing anything unusual. And you see the yellow is the actual glottal stop. That's included. That's increased a good bit. The green is the laryngalized or glottalized vowel that you see in the last example that I gave. And an increasing number of people are simply deleting it altogether. That's the blue. So this is happening very slowly. There's not a huge amount of social awareness of it. Sarah has started doing pilot studies to see if people think that this makes a difference in sounds. Does it sound more informal or less informal to people, and so on. So I'm going to quickly do one last little piece here. This is work with Cris Font-Santiago, who just finished his PhD and went back home, got a job at the University of Puerto Rico. His dream job, first job he applied for, which is a remarkable thing. There's a lot of lore around the pronunciation of place names. One story in linguistics is that we can tell a whole lot about how people do rhythmic structure, metrical structure, by how they pronounce place names. The other is that these are shibboleths, that there are ways that you can tell where somebody's from. If somebody knows how to say Economowoc, they're probably from Wisconsin. And if they know how to say Conshohocken, they're probably from a certain part of Pennsylvania. So we actually did a study, and Cris speaks vastly more standard English than I do. And so we got him to say things two different ways.
Kakana. 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 Kakana.
And for each one, he had one, like clip 2 here, that's close to the way people pronounce it in the place. And one, like clip 1 here, not like that. And we asked people whether they said it like clip 1 or clip 2, or they have two different ways of saying it, like with Oregon and Oregon, for the city in Wisconsin and the state of the Union. I don't pronounce it either way, like either of those clips, and I have no idea how to say this name. So what we did was we asked a bunch of participants. This was a different study, a very new study, still not published, but about to be soon. We asked people from Wisconsin, from Pennsylvania, and from Georgia to judge some places from pronunciation of places from those states. And you can see that it's really overwhelming. If you know how to pronounce Conshohocken and Economowoc, you're probably from Wisconsin and Pennsylvania for those two examples. So we have a lot of evidence. There's a huge amount of a story behind this of people using these things to judge whether you're native. Like I recently just blundered on a place name from Wisconsin that I know perfectly well around a whole bunch of Wisconsinites, and it disrupted a serious conversation for 5 minutes while people made fun of me. So it happens. So general conclusions, Wisconsin English is really remarkably new, and the awareness of Wisconsin English is new and increasing pretty rapidly. People have positive attitudes toward it. Those attitudes are, of course, more complicated socially and politically. Going back to the bubbler example, the features that we associate with Wisconsin English aren't used by everybody in Wisconsin, certainly. the big story here, and this is what's exciting for us, is that it's changing very rapidly. I'm working with a couple of undergraduates and some graduate students now who are looking at those changes, all sorts of different changes. So with that, I will thank you very much for your attention, and we can open it up to the Q&A. And Joy, there were hands going up I saw while I was talking. Let's go.
Sure. If you have some specific questions, you can also type them into chat or Q&A if you're there. It's okay. We're not taking your audio questions, but we will take your written questions. You wanted to circle back to a couple of the comments in Q&A. So I think I will get a little bit more detail on the Plymouth, Wisconsin woman from the 1950s who really did sound quite British to me, and the woman from Plymouth from modern day or closer to today, really sounding like a Wisconsinite. Help me understand what happened there. Was it the proximity to immigration that the 50s person sounded so different, or what is the reason for the difference in those two people sounding so different?
So people, and this ties to immigration in a really interesting way. It takes after speakers form a new community. So Wisconsin was colonized by English speakers, but also by speakers of a lot of other languages. And it takes several generations for them to sort of develop their own way of speaking. So a lot of the ways of speaking that we hear are ways that reflect where people came from. So areas where you have a lot of early settlement from upstate New York or Maine or something, you still have those in early speech. You still have those accents reflected in even the children and grandchildren of those speakers. So this is a part of the dynamic, and it really ties to immigration. And it's just now starting to happen, in part because while there's a lot of colonization here in the 19th century, a lot of those people were living their lives speaking Polish and speaking Norwegian and other languages. So it's only when they start speaking English that kicks in. And you get direct influences from those languages. There are lots of them. The "come here once" that somebody put into the chat at the beginning, that's a straight up Germanism. It's the word "once" is used in German to soften a command. So you can't just say "come here" in German. It sounds like a military order. And what people do is they soften it by using the word that means once. And that's just been taken over wholesale into English from German. So some stuff is like that. Some stuff has come through and changed, like the tag questions were. And so there's a sort of mediated pattern, but it takes several generations of people, kids growing up together and adapting each other's features and settling it out. The woman, I don't believe the woman in the 50s was on NPR, but oh, so Tammy knows more than I do. I have to look and see. I'm pretty sure that she was not a radio person. Cassidy chose community members, and I don't think that she would have been a public radio person. So we see that, and we see that developing over taking generations. But part of what's happening here is that in the mid 20th century, you still had a lot of people taking elocution classes, and so they shaped their formal speech. And of course, Cassidy was a professor from the UW, and so she's speaking her fanciest English, as somebody pointed out when we played those, very formal sounding. So that's part of what's happening there. Does that get the basics of that question?
Yeah, it does. I'm a "come here once" person, so I've said that before. I remember my husband too saying, "Why once? Why not twice?" So you didn't quite understand where that came from. We have Carla and Michael mentioned that after the movie Fargo, everyone associated that accent that was used in Fargo with the Upper Midwest. What was going on with that accent? That didn't really sound like Fargo to me either.
really interesting. When the movie came out, of course, we went around and asked whole lots of Wisconsinites, does this sound, and Minnesotans, does this sound like how you talk? And we had really interesting splits. A lot of people said, oh, no, that's horrible. Why would they do that to the way we actually speak? And a whole bunch of other people said, yeah, it's a little exaggerated, but it's pretty close to what we do. But what happens is that raises awareness. It gets people thinking about these regional variants. Yes, Cindy says, I have in-laws in Minnesota who talk like that and they're Norwegian. Yes, you get a lot of associations with Norwegian there. And Michael Stevens points out a connection to German, and something that we might come back to if there's time. But what it does is it raises awareness. Oh, these people have a particular way of speaking in Wisconsin that people weren't necessarily thinking about. So my sister still lives in North Carolina. She lives in Durham now, and in a suburb, and they've had a lot of people come from the north down there to work in the Research Triangle and so on. And when that started happening, I had all these conversations with her and other relatives. So, what in the world? What is that? I've never heard anybody talk like that. That sounds sort of Canadian. What are they doing? So there was no awareness of Wisconsin English as a thing. And that's, Fargo is part of what I think gets people started thinking, raising awareness that there is this kind of regional variation. And it's really good that somebody raised that issue. It's definitely a piece of it. Sarah Palin and her upper Midwestern sounding accent, people thought, is another example of that, which was, we actually wrote a whole article about Sarah Palin and how she does and doesn't sound upper Midwestern. There's a long story behind that.
Did you see the Willem Dafoe hosted
Yes.
Saturday Night Live? Yeah, where he's an Appleton native, as I am. A lot of people were saying, "Oh, that's not how people in Appleton talk. That's more the UP or even Canada."
So the last time I did this talk, I actually played that clip with Dafoe speaking and sounding fairly Wisconsin start to finish, especially when they ask him to do his Wisconsin accent. But the reaction to the cast members who were doing trying to do Appleton really got a lot of negative reactions. Oh no, that's not how we sound. That's overdone. So go back and listen to that. And one person even said, "Oh, I think they're making fun of how we talk." And I think that's not what the intent of the skit was, although it's never too far away with anything on Saturday Night Live. But yeah, it's definitely worth watching. It's very interesting. I played it to a class I'm teaching and had a really interesting discussion with Wisconsinites and non-Wisconsinites about about what it meant. And the Wisconsinites agreed that Willem Dafoe from start to finish sounded more Wisconsin than the non-Wisconsinites.
Chuck asks, are there major subcategories of Wisconsin English, perhaps geographical?
Yes, absolutely. So the Southeast is and has long been very different from the rest of the state in all sorts of ways. A lot of attention goes to vowel pronunciations, but it's not just vowel pronunciations. There is what's called the Northern Cities region, which stretches basically from Buffalo and Rochester over to Milwaukee. You get particular pronunciations there. It's sort of stereotypical Chicago in part. People say things like bad for bad. And by the time you get to Madison, you don't get very much of that. That's sort of reversing in the southeast part of the state. But that's something that was never widespread in western or northern Wisconsin for sure. And yes, Cindy, it is surely connected with migration routes through the Great Lakes. So that the places where that change is found patterns very closely with where migrants came through in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So we don't know yet a whole lot about the regional variation within the state. One thing that is very interesting and important and promising is the emergence of urban versus rural differences. So in past times, people who say them over there instead of them over there, that was regarded as a classic immigrant feature, Irish English, Norwegian English, German English, and so on. Today, it's still around. Lots of people use it, including young people, but it's much more associated with rural. Whereas 50 years ago or 100 years ago, it was heavily associated with urban areas like Milwaukee and Chicago. Yes, I have interesting pronunciations of almost everything.
I missed it. I missed it. So found, she thinks you say found differently. Yeah.
So it's very different from Wisconsin. One of the things that might be giving away our young Wisconsin speakers' accents is that ow sound, the ah is pretty different. It starts farther back in the mouth, so you get more of a found and less of a found, like I have, which it's a piece of the Southern accent that I haven't lost. Louise, there's a huge amount to be said about the English of indigenous peoples. There's a whole literature on that topic, and what's happening now with revitalization of indigenous languages. I'm taking a Menominee language class right now, for example, is that we're starting to see this the language is coming back in really interesting and important ways. But at the same time, people have distinct varieties of English that they've developed. And this has happened all across the country, but there's a lot of similarity. I was talking to a Meskwaki woman from Iowa last week, and she said, have you noticed that Native people, whether they're from Iowa or Wisconsin or Michigan or Minnesota, we all sound sort of the same? I said, yes. So that's happening. It's not a topic for research right now. People who are interested in indigenous languages are really putting all of their focus mostly on revitalization and getting languages into general use, what we call renormalization now. So that's a big piece of it.
But as we're running short on time, Lynn wants to know in the Q&A section, why is Wisconsin English changing?
Really interesting question. Some changes are just sort of sweeping through the country. So I pronounce the man's name Don and the woman's name Dawn really different. Increasing numbers of people pronounce them the same. And that's just coming through. It's a train that's sweeping across the country and is coming through here. A lot of other changes have to do with movement of populations and people picking up things as they have contact to people with different accents. But all languages change, and they're changing constantly. Even you think, oh, people who live in isolated areas, their languages don't change, but they do, and they change way more than you think. They might change a little less than high traffic areas of a lot of population movement, but they're changing as well. Part of it is social. Young people is famously noted a lot. Don't want to sound like their parents, and they do want to sound like their peers. And so you get these peer group changes where people agree, okay, we're going to pronounce, I mean, not explicitly agree, but they tacitly agree, this is, if you're cool, you want to sound this way. And a lot of stuff starts that way. So these changes, like the bad change in the northern cities, that is starting to retreat in a lot of places. I was talking to Sarah Holmstrom, whose work I cited here, about this yesterday, and she's from Chicago and doesn't have a strong Chicago accent. And she said, yeah, but a lot of the people I grew up with do. And I think it's about orientation. You know, how tied are you to our neighborhood, and how mobile are you? So people who are still tied to the neighborhood have that accent. People who are more likely to move away, like her coming to Madison, are more likely not to. So if we're running short on time, really fast, zinc, yes, Cindy, this is one that's around. It's often associated with Dutch immigrant communities. It's also found in Texas. I know a Texan, African-American from Eastern Texas, a little bit older than me, who says that his relatives used to say it. So that's a part of it. Yes, in mid-20th century, there was a team that went around and did radio shows where they would ask people to say, just say a few sentences and they could guess where they were from. I am amazed by that. And I think that's almost impossible to do today.
So will our future generations in Wisconsin be speaking differently than me or no?
Perfect. Yes, and the strong suspicion among people who are working on this stuff is that regional differences are going to get larger and not smaller. Some regional differences are going away. Other regional differences are growing. So even in the triangle where a lot of people are not from North Carolina, and people who are don't want to sound traditional, so they don't say and things like that. They've got all sorts of other sound changes that are happening that still identify them. So young people in the triangle will say their O in a way that's very different from what you hear in Wisconsin. So up here, you still get a lot of people saying phone. There it's phone. And it's very striking, even if people aren't quite aware of it.
Well, I wish we did have more time. So many questions. This has been really fascinating, Professor Salmons. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Please email me if I didn't get around to your question, or if you want to follow up or something. I'm easy to find online. Just drop me a line. I will always answer questions, and I may even put you in touch with students.
Wonderful. Thanks again. Joe Salmons is a professor of language sciences at UW-Madison. Thanks to everybody for your participation. Very interesting lecture today. I think we have a lecture in the works for April. Date's not set yet, but it will be on stargazing and the night skies. We will have an interesting program on that coming up in April. Watch the website for more details. Thanks very much for being here. I'm Joy Cardine.